with the White House confirming there will be no Trump-Putin meeting in the near future, as well as no breakthrough regarding the Tomahawk missiles, and Russia ramping up its attacks against Ukraine's energy infrastructure, the end of war seems as distant as ever. And to talk about it, we're joined by Michael Carpenter, Senior Fellow at the International Institute for Strategic Studies and former Senior Director for Europe at the U.S. National Security Council, and also former U.S. Ambassador to OSCE. Good evening, Mr. Ambassador. Let me start with a quote. "It's incorrect to say the meeting was delayed because no agreement existed to begin with." That's from the Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov. Now, given the current state of affairs, with no summit on the horizon, what should we expect from both Washington and Moscow in the coming weeks?
Well, I think on the Russian side, you see a very consistent fact pattern over the course of the last 10 months, or essentially the tenure of this administration. Russia has escalated at every stage since the beginning of the year. It has struck Ukrainian cities with hundreds of missiles and drones almost every single night, often targeting critical civilian infrastructure in the process. And I have no doubt that as we head into winter, that Russia will continue its aerial campaign against Ukraine, escalating and trying to strike energy infrastructure as well to try to plunge Ukraine into cold and darkness this winter and try to gain some leverage that way. When it comes to the United States, it's a little bit more difficult to predict what the next steps will be. But one thing is very consistent across all these months of Trump administration and various different statements, and that is the U.S. has applied no sanctions on Russia. It has applied tariffs on virtually every country in the world except Russia, and it has provided no assistance to Ukraine. So the desire for a reset with Russia is very real, I think, on the part of this administration. They very much want to be able to do business with Russia, to get back into deal-making mode. But so long as the war continues, that's impossible. And so, whether President Trump will continue his diplomacy remains to be seen.
Having said that, Mr. Ambassador, last month, Secretary of State Marco Rubio said that, that his administration has a limited patience towards Russia. Now, how do these words sound a month later, as Russians seemed absolutely to stall the peace process again and reject the very idea of freezing the conflict at the current front line?
Well, again, look, I think the Russians are very predictable. They have maximalist gains or rather, I should say, maximalist goals for Ukraine. They seek the 5 oblasts in the south and east: Crimea, Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson. That's clear. They would like de jure recognition of their annexation of these 5 oblasts as well. And they'll keep fighting until they achieve their aims. At this point, there is nothing that suggests that President Putin would deviate from his aims with regards to Ukraine. When it comes to the Trump administration, as I said, I think the overriding aim of this administration is to reset relations with Russia, to lift sanctions, and essentially to do business for the benefit of both sides. But the administration can't do that so long as there's a war and so long as there's sanctions on Russia. And so they're trying to find a solution. But at every stage of this war and at every stage of the diplomacy, including most notably at the Alaska summit, they've refused to put leverage on Russia. And I think most commentators will agree that without leverage on Russia, it's very difficult to foresee any way to bring this war to a negotiated resolution.
Well, that's interesting, because it seemed until the last Friday that Ukraine finally had Donald Trump on their side. Now, what do you think has happened during the American and Russian president's phone call?
Well, to be honest, I don't think it's all that material what happened in the phone call. I suspect that President Trump in his readout on Truth Social noted that they talked about trade. And it was a 2.5-hour call, so I can imagine that there was a lot of discussion of trade, which, by the way, U.S.-Russia bilateral trade is about $5 billion, which is minuscule in global proportions. For relative reference, that's about a quarter of our trade with, say, Guatemala. So it's very, very little. But that, I think what's important to understand with the Trump administration is that there's a very deliberate policy of tacking back and forth from saying that Ukraine has no cards in February to saying that Ukraine can win, from suggesting that there's going to be no support for Ukraine militarily to suggesting that perhaps Tomahawks are on the table. It's a very deliberate process of going back and forth to leave people guessing and ultimately to forestall criticism because this way observers will give the administration the benefit of the doubt. But as I said, it's more important to look at the deeds and not at the words. And when it comes to actions, this administration has been very consistent. And that consistency has been in applying no costs whatsoever on Moscow.
Yet words also have their value. Now, as a diplomat, what do you make of Donald Trump's words that Putin has, quote, won himself certain property in Ukraine? Now, is Washington really legitimizing the Russian gains in its war of aggression?
Well, the quote you just cited sure appears that way. Not to mention the fact that the United States president welcomed Vladimir Putin, who's an indicted war criminal in Alaska, by literally rolling out the red carpet, as you're showing there to your viewers. This was a form of legitimation that Putin could have only dreamed of, months ago, or certainly in the last administration of Joe Biden. So we're in a different world right now. And yes, the administration is absolutely signaling that it is tolerant of a naked land grab as a form of acquiring territory. And Mr. Witkoff, who is Trump's special envoy for Russia and Ukraine, has on many occasions evinced support for Putin's declaration that there have been referenda in these occupied territories that legitimately make them part of Russia. Of course, the rest of the world doesn't see things that way. But in the United States administration under this president, there is a consistent pattern of trying to legitimate some of these gains by force.
Mm-hmm. According to Bloomberg, Washington opposes the European proposal of using proceeds from Russia's frozen assets to help finance Kiev's military. Now, do you think there's a chance it will change anytime soon?
Well, I sure hope so. But this was, frankly, something that I was not expecting either. I was hoping that the Trump administration would support the use of the immobilized assets because ultimately this is not U.S. taxpayer money. And President Trump, according to the America First mantra, has not wanted to use American resources to fund the war, to fund Ukraine's ability to defend itself, but has been open to other suggestions, including the sale of U.S. weapons and equipment to NATO allies to give to Ukraine. So I had been hoping that the administration would look favorably on this proposal, which is rather creative in terms of the details, because it does not seize these assets outright, but it creates a special purpose vehicle that will allow for a loan to be given to Ukraine in a very sizable amount, roughly 150 billion euro. And so it's very unfortunate for Ukraine because these assets are badly needed both to plug a budget hole in Ukraine, but also to procure military equipment.
Assets held by Europe. Mr. Ambassador, this will be the last question. On Monday, EU energy ministers agreed to phase out all gas contracts with Russia by 2028. Starting next year. Now, this has already been dubbed a scandal by Hungary, Russia's close ally, and Russia seems to be losing its leverage over Europe. Now, is there anything apart from threatening Europe with the use of nuclear weapons that the Kremlin can still, in fact, threaten the EU with?
Well, I would set aside the dangerous and irresponsible nuclear rhetoric. And no, I think that Russia will continue its hybrid war against Europe as it has been waging for at least a decade. So I think we can expect to see continued sabotage operations, gray zone attacks, arson, et cetera, et cetera. However, it's been long overdue for Europe to wean itself off of all Russian hydrocarbon purchases. And there still remain a number of loopholes or cutouts in the sanctions regime, which is, by the way, way too slow. Europe should be stopping the purchase of Russian hydrocarbons yesterday or tomorrow, not in 2028 or not beginning next year. That's far too slow, in my opinion. But look, there are a number of countries that buy Russian crude, that refine it, and then sell that refined product to European countries. So there are these loopholes that are still being unaddressed by the European Commission. And until Europe gets serious about cutting Russia's war machine off from these revenues, Russia will continue to have the resources to be able to wage war for years to come. So this is really something that European politicians need to focus more on. They need to act quicker and more decisively to cut off Russia's revenues from oil and gas.
Michael Carpenter, Senior Fellow at the International Institute for Strategic Studies and former Senior Director for Europe at the U.S. National Security Council, was our guest this evening. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
And thank you for watching, and stay with us for much more news and interviews here on TVP World.